A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
You know, there is this specific kind of silence that happens right after a massive news story breaks in a place where nobody is allowed to go. It is that tense, suffocating period where social media is absolutely screaming with blurry videos, frantic Telegram posts, and conflicting claims, while the major newsrooms just sit there with a blank screen or a developing story banner. We saw it play out in real time just a few days ago, on the night of March 20th and the morning of the 21st, with the missile incident at the Diego Garcia military base. It is the ultimate black box scenario. You have a remote atoll in the middle of the Indian Ocean, a high-security joint US-UK facility, and suddenly reports of ballistic missiles in the air. Today's prompt from Daniel is about exactly that gap, the verification gap. He wants us to look at the technical workflows behind how modern newsrooms actually separate fact from disinformation when they cannot get a single reporter on the ground.
It is a fascinating problem, Korn, because we have officially moved past the era where a journalist just trusts a guy in a trench coat or a single high-level source at the Pentagon. I am Herman Poppleberry, by the way, and I have been digging into the forensic side of this all morning. The Diego Garcia situation was the ultimate stress test for these systems because, as Daniel pointed out, that atoll is one of the most restricted patches of dirt on the planet. When those Iranian ballistic missiles were supposedly in the air, there were no civilian witnesses with cell phones standing on the beach. There were no independent news crews. Every piece of data had to be scraped from the sky, pulled from encrypted government channels, or triangulated from open-source sensors.
And that is where the verification gap lives. Most people hear the phrase, the BBC has verified this footage, and they think it means a producer called a friend at the Ministry of Defense who said, yeah, that happened. But in 2026, that is not how it works. Verification is now a full-blown data science project. It is about cryptographic signatures, shadow geometry, and multispectral satellite analysis. So, Herman, let's start at the beginning. When a newsroom like BBC Verify or the Wall Street Journal says they are working to verify a report about a strike on a remote base, what is the very first thing actually happening on their screens?
The first thing they look for is what we call the digital paper trail, or provenance. In the last few years, the industry has rallied around a standard called C2PA, which stands for the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity. This is a cryptographic layer that gets baked into a file at the moment of creation. If a military contractor or a sailor on a nearby ship took a photo of an interceptor launch on their phone, and that phone is C2PA compliant, that file contains a manifest. That manifest says, this image was captured by this specific sensor at this specific coordinate at this exact millisecond, and it has not been altered by a single pixel since then. It is a digital chain of custody.
But surely the bad actors know about that? If I am the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or even just a bored troll trying to push a fake video of a successful strike to drive down the stock market or influence a diplomatic meeting, I'm not going to include a helpful manifest that says this was made in a basement in Tehran using a generative AI model.
And that is the whole point. The absence of a C2PA signature is now a massive red flag. It is like trying to enter a high-security building without an identification badge. You might be who you say you are, but we are going to search you a lot harder. But even without that signature, analysts move into what they call chronolocation and geolocation. Take the Diego Garcia attack. The atoll has a very distinctive L-shaped runway. It is iconic. If a video surfaces on X or Telegram claiming to show an explosion on the base, the first thing an analyst at a unit like BBC Verify does is pull up high-resolution satellite imagery from providers like Maxar Technologies or the Sentinel-2 satellites. They look for that runway geometry. They look for the specific placement of the fuel bladders and the hangar orientations. They are looking for ground truth anchors.
I remember seeing one of those clips on the night of the 20th. It looked incredibly convincing to the untrained eye. It had the grainy night vision look, the shaky cam, the sound of a distant boom. But within an hour, people were pointing out that the shadows were all wrong. It is funny how the sun and the moon are the two things you can't really hack, even in 2026.
You are hitting on a fundamental truth of forensic analysis. Shadow analysis is a cornerstone of chronolocation. If you know the exact coordinates of the Diego Garcia Atoll, which we do, and you know the date is March 20th, you can calculate the precise angle of the sun or the moon at any given minute. If the shadows in a leaked video are pointing toward the northwest, but at that time of day on that specific island they should be pointing due north, the video is a fake. Period. It is often a cheap fake, a repurposed clip from a training exercise in a different part of the world, like the 2021 exercises in the Nevada desert that we saw being circulated last week as live footage from the Indian Ocean.
It is a bit cheeky, really. These disinformation campaigns are often just lazy. They take old footage, add some digital grain, maybe a fake timestamp, and hope the sheer speed of the news cycle carries it through. But it seems like the tools for catching them are getting much more sophisticated. You mentioned something about Google DeepMind earlier.
Yes, SynthID is the big one we are seeing integrated into newsroom workflows this year. It is a tool developed by Google DeepMind that embeds an invisible digital watermark into synthetic media. It does not change the look of the image or the video, but it survives cropping, heavy compression, and even screen recording. When a newsroom runs a file through their forensic suite, Synth1D can tell them if the image was generated or altered by an artificial intelligence model. It is a game of cat and mouse, but for the Diego Garcia event, it allowed the major outlets to quickly ignore about 90% of the noise coming out of social media. They could see the AI fingerprints on the videos of the supposed massive fire at the fuel depot.
Okay, so they use these tools to prove the file itself is authentic. But that is only half the battle, right? Just because a video is a real, unedited clip of a missile flying through the air doesn't mean it is a missile hitting Diego Garcia on March 20th. It could be a defensive interceptor, or a test launch from months ago, or even a meteor. How do they bridge the gap between this is a real video and this is a factually accurate report of what happened?
That is where multi-source triangulation comes in. In the Diego Garcia case, you had a very specific set of claims. The Iranian missiles supposedly had a range of about 2,500 miles, or 4,000 kilometers. This was a massive shock to the system because, as we discussed back in episode 1440, Iran's publicly disclosed range was only about half that. So, the newsrooms had to verify the engineering reality of that flight path. They couldn't just take the IRGC's word for it, and they couldn't just take the Pentagon's word for it either. They used open source intelligence to track the heat signatures detected by early warning satellites.
I love that we live in a world where civilian analysts can basically play amateur, NORAD. You have these guys on Telegram and X who are looking at publicly available infrared data from weather satellites and spotting the launch plumes. It makes the official narrative much harder to fake.
It is the democratization of intelligence. When the BBC or the Wall Street Journal says they have verified the event, they are looking for an overlap between three distinct pillars. Pillar 1 is the official statement, like the condemnation from UK Foreign Secretary Yvette Cooper, who called the strikes reckless on the morning of the 21st. Pillar 2 is the technical data, like the satellite imagery from Maxar showing the total lack of impact craters on the atoll, which confirms the missiles missed or were intercepted. And Pillar 3 is the forensic verification of any visual evidence. If all three pillars align, the government says it happened, the satellites show no damage, and the videos show an interceptor launch. They feel confident enough to put that little verified badge on the story.
There was a moment during the reporting where there was a lot of confusion about whether there had been an explosion on the island itself. Some officials were saying one thing, and the satellite images weren't coming in fast enough because of heavy cloud cover over the Indian Ocean. It felt like the newsrooms were actually holding back information rather than rushing to be first. Is that a new trend?
It is a massive shift toward what researchers are calling friction checking. In the past, the goal was to be first. Now, the goal is to be the most reliable because the cost of being wrong is so high. When the Chagos Archipelago Sovereignty Agreement was finalized recently by Prime Minister Keir Starmer's government, giving Mauritius control while the UK keeps a 99-year lease on the base, it created a massive geopolitical tinderbox. If a news outlet had incorrectly reported a successful strike that killed dozens of people, it could have triggered a massive military retaliation before the truth was out.
So the newsrooms are intentionally slowing down. They are adding friction to the process to ensure they aren't being played by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps or any other actor trying to stir the pot. I find it interesting that they are now analyzing the why behind the lies. It is not just, is this fake, but why is this fake trending right now?
That is exactly what units like BBC Verify are doing. They look at the emotional wounds being exploited. During the March 21st reporting, there was a narrative trending that the base had been completely neutralized and that the U.S. Navy was fleeing the area. Analysts realized this wasn't just a random lie, it was a targeted campaign to make the joint U.S. and U.K. defenses look obsolete in the face of new Iranian technology. By identifying the intent, the journalists can frame their reporting not just as, here are the facts, but here is how you are being manipulated. It turns the journalist into a sort of digital psychologist.
I suspect some of our listeners are thinking, well, if the newsrooms are just using official statements and satellite images provided by big corporations, how independent is this verification really? If the U.S. military says we intercepted the missile, and the newsroom says we have verified that the missile was intercepted, are they just repeating the government line with extra steps?
That is a very fair critique, and it is why there is so much pressure for newsrooms to provide the receipts. In 2026, a reputable report should ideally include the raw satellite coordinates they used and the metadata logs if possible. We saw this with the Diego Garcia reporting where some independent analysts actually pointed to the specific destroyer, a U.S. Navy ship, and showed its position relative to the projected flight path of the missile using AIS ship tracking data. When you can see the math, the need for blind trust disappears. You aren't trusting the journalist, you are auditing their work.
It turns the audience into auditors. Instead of saying, trust us, we are the experts, the newsrooms are saying, here is the dataset we used, go ahead and check our work. It is a much more robust way of building credibility in an era where everyone is skeptical of everything. But, Herman, let's talk about the limitations. Even with Maxar satellites and Synth ID, there must be things we still don't know about that night.
Verification is an asymptotic process. You get closer and closer to the truth, but in a restricted zone you rarely hit 100%. We know one missile failed mid-flight and one was intercepted. But because we do not have boots on the ground, we do not know the exact extent of the debris field. We don't know if there was minor damage to peripheral sensors or communication arrays that the military isn't talking about. We are seeing the event through a keyhole, a very high-tech keyhole, but a keyhole nonetheless.
I think that is a healthy way to look at it. It is about reducing uncertainty, not eliminating it. What really struck me about the Diego Garcia incident was the range of those missiles. We have to talk about that for a second, because it fundamentally changes the verification landscape. If Iran can hit a target 4,000 kilometers away, the number of potential flashpoints that journalists have to monitor has just exploded.
The engineering hurdles to double your range like that are immense. It suggests a leap in propulsion technology or a significant reduction in warhead weight, possibly using more advanced composite materials. From a verification standpoint, this means we can no longer rely on old assumptions about who can reach where. When a flash of light is spotted over the Indian Ocean, we can't just say, oh, that can't be a missile from the mainland because it is too far away. The physics have changed, and the verification models have to change with them. We have to look at the 4,000-kilometer sniper shot as the new baseline.
It makes the work of places like Bellingcat even more vital. They have been pioneering these techniques for years, often long before the mainstream media caught on. They were the ones who first started using things like the sound of a bird in the background of a video to identify the continent where it was filmed.
Bioacoustics. That is a brilliant example of a verification tool that sounds like science fiction but is actually very practical. If someone claims a video is from Diego Garcia, but you hear a bird that only lives in the mountains of Iran, the game is up. It is about looking for the things the fakers forgot to fake. They might get the runway right, They might even get the shadows right, but they forget the local flora or the specific way the waves break against that atoll's reef. The physical world is incredibly complex and messy.
There is something poetic about a high-tech disinformation campaign being brought down by a bird chirping in the background. It brings us back to the idea that the physical world is very hard to simulate perfectly. You can make a deepfake of a politician's face, but simulating the entire atmospheric, biological, and geological context of a remote island is a much taller order.
For now at least. But as the generative models get better, the verification gap might start to widen again. We are already seeing AI that can generate consistent environments across multiple angles. The next step is AI that understands the physics of shadows and the specific light spectra of different latitudes. That is why the cryptographic signatures we talked about, like C2PA, are the only long-term solution. We have to move from verifying the content to verifying the origin.
It is a move from "what does this look like" to "where did this come from?" It is essentially the digital version of a chain of custody in a criminal investigation. If you can't prove who held the file from the moment it was created, you can't use it as evidence. But Herman, that sounds like a tough spot for a source. If you are a whistleblower at a military base, you want to remain anonymous. If you provide metadata that leads right back to your device, you're finished.
That is the technical paradox of 2026. We explored this a bit in episode 967 regarding Tehran access. There are some interesting developments in zero-knowledge proofs that might help. The idea is that you can prove a piece of information is true without revealing the information itself. You could, in theory, prove that a photo was taken on Diego Garcia without revealing the serial number of the phone that took it. But we are still in the early stages of making that user-friendly for a source in a high-pressure environment.
So, for the average person scrolling through their feed during the next global crisis, which, let's face it, is probably coming sooner than we think, what are the practical takeaways here? How do we apply a bit of this newsroom rigor to our own consumption?
The first thing is to look for the receipts. If a report says they have verified something, do they explain how? Do they mention satellite imagery or metadata or chronolocation? If they are just saying, "we have verified it" because an unnamed official told them, you should treat that with a healthy dose of skepticism. It is not that the official is necessarily lying, but as we saw with Diego Garcia, the official might only have a tiny piece of a very large puzzle.
And check the source of the visual evidence. If a video is being shared as a raw file with no context, or if it is a screen recording of a screen recording, that is a huge red flag. Always try to find the earliest possible version of a clip. The closer you get to the original file, the less likely it is to have been tampered with or repurposed from a 2021 training exercise.
Also, be aware of your own emotional triggers. Disinformation thrives on high-tension moments. During the March attack, the most viral stories were the ones that claimed the highest casualties or the most dramatic failures of Western technology. The truth, which was that the defenses mostly worked and nobody was killed, was much less exciting and therefore traveled much slower. If a story makes you want to immediately scream or share it in anger, that is the exact moment you should step back and wait for the verification tools to do their work.
It is the old line about the truth putting on its shoes while the lie is halfway around the world. In 2026, the truth just has a lot more buckles to fasten before it can leave the house. But those buckles are what keep us from falling for a narrative that could literally start a war.
It is a heavy responsibility for the newsrooms, and I think we are seeing them take it more seriously. The launch of units like BBC Verify and the integration of tools like Cint1D show an industry that is finally waking up to the fact that they are no longer just narrators of the news. They are the auditors of reality.
Auditors of reality. I like that. It certainly beats just being the guy who reads the teleprompter. It feels like we are entering an era where the journalist is more like a forensic investigator than a storyteller.
It is the only way forward. As the tools for creation become more powerful, the tools for verification have to become even more robust. The Diego Garcia incident was a wake-up call, not just because of the missiles, but because of the fog of war that surrounded them. We were lucky that the technical community was able to pierce that fog as quickly as they did.
It makes me wonder what the next test will be. If it is not a remote island, but a major city where the data is even more chaotic, will these systems hold up? I guess we will find out soon enough, given the way things are going.
The infrastructure is being built as we speak. Every time one of these events happens, the forensic models get a little bit better, the satellite cadence gets a little bit faster, and the public becomes a little bit more savvy. We are essentially building a global immune system against digital deception.
Well, let's hope that immune system is ready for whatever comes next. This has been a deep dive into a topic that I think is going to define the rest of this decade. Thanks as always to our producer Hilbert Flumingtop for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes.
And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show. It is the kind of infrastructure that makes this level of analysis possible.
If you want to dig into our archive and see how these verification stories have evolved over the last few years, head over to myweirdprompts.com. You can search for everything from satellite forensics to the history of the Chagos Archipelago.
This has been My Weird Prompts. We will be back soon with another deep dive into whatever Daniel throws our way.
Stay skeptical out there.
And keep checking those receipts. Goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to